It was a busy Saturday afternoon at the city mall, the kind of day when the place seemed to breathe with its own life. Families pushed strollers past storefronts. Teenagers in groups laughed and teased each other while testing the latest gadgets. And the faint aroma of freshly baked pretzels mingled with the scent of coffee from a nearby cafe. The mall's public piano, sitting proudly near the center of the corridor, had already drawn a small crowd. A pianist, dressed neatly in black, was performing with confidence, fingers dancing across the keys with practiced ease. His music carried through the air, flowing around shoppers as a pleasant background soundtrack to their errands and window shopping. People often stopped for a moment to listen, some smiling, some nodding their heads in rhythm with the melody. The pianist smiled too, clearly enjoying the attention, though he seemed used to it. He had played here many times before and knew exactly how to hold an audience. For most, this was just a charming distraction, a short pause in their busy day. But for a few, there was a spark of curiosity, a feeling that music was more than just noise. It was something that could reach inside and stir emotions they didn't always expect to feel in a place like a mall. At that moment, a man approached the piano. He was unassuming in appearance, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, carrying a small satchel over his shoulder. There was nothing flashy about him. In fact, if someone had passed him by on the escalator or in a shop, they might not have noticed him at all. But there was a calm confidence in his movements, a quiet patience as he made his way toward the piano. He didn't rush, didn't push past anyone, and didn't try to draw attention to himself. He simply walked, stepped up to the piano, and asked politely if he could have a turn. Some of the people nearby chuckled softly. They thought it would be amusing to see someone they assumed was just an ordinary person, perhaps even a novice, sit at the piano and fumble through a few simple notes. The mall pianist, who had been finishing a complex piece, gave a small, polite smile. He had seen many people attempt to play, most of whom lacked any real skill. He nodded, expecting nothing more than another momentary curiosity, another set of hesitant fingers that would barely make a melody. The man thanked him quietly, his voice calm, and lowered himself onto the piano bench. He adjusted it slightly, then settled in, sitting upright but relaxed. His hands hovered above the keys for a brief moment, and a few of the spectators noticed his posture. It wasn't like the hurried, uncertain movements of someone trying to play for the first time. There was a sense of purpose, a quiet assurance that these hands knew exactly what they were about to do. But most of the crowd was already turning back to their conversations, assuming that a few awkward notes and smiles would follow. A teenager in the crowd whispered, "Watch him mess up. This'll be funny." His friend laughed and nodded, thinking it was going to be entertaining in the simplest way. A couple walking past slowed down, glancing at the scene, curious about why the small group had gathered, but they didn't linger for long. For most people, the piano was just another fixture in the mall, a brief distraction in the middle of shopping and errands. The man at the piano took a deep breath and flexed his fingers slowly, as though warming them up. The mall pianist, now leaning slightly forward, noticed the movement. He had seen this before. Confident hands often signaled skill, but it could also be a trick of appearance. Sometimes beginners thought they looked impressive, but couldn't produce much music. Still, something about the way the man moved his hands felt different. There was a fluidity, a readiness that suggested more than just casual play. He pressed the first key. The sound rang clear and deliberate, startling in its precision. The crowd, which had been half interested and half distracted, suddenly quieted. The note seemed to fill the space between the shops, weaving itself into the background hum of the mall in a way that made people stop walking, stop talking, and listen. It was not loud or showy, just perfect, measured, and full of warmth. Man's fingers began to move, not hesitantly, but with certainty. He started with a slow, gentle melody that was delicate yet full of emotion. The mall pianist's eyebrows rose slightly. He had been playing professionally for years, and he could tell when someone's skill was real. He leaned a little closer, watching the man's hands glide across the keys. There was a rhythm, a flow, a connection to the music that was undeniable. The fingers weren't just pressing the keys. They were telling a story. Shoppers passing by began to notice. Some paused mid-step, caught by the unusual clarity of the music. A young mother lifted her child to the railing above the piano, and even the child's wide eyes reflected a sense of wonder. Employees from nearby stores peeked out, drawn by the sound. Slowly, the small group of onlookers grew. People pulled out their phones, not to mock, but to capture the unexpected performance. Whispers spread among the crowd. "Wow, listen to that. Who is that? I didn't expect anyone to play like this." The man did not rush. Each note, each pause, felt intentional. The music ebbed and flowed, soft then strong, delicate then powerful, as if he were speaking through the piano itself. It wasn't just skill. It was understanding, emotion, timing, the kind of playing that could make people feel something deep and sudden in the middle of an ordinary day. Some of the skeptical teenagers fell silent. Their earlier laughter was replaced by awe. The couple who had been glancing casually now stood, holding hands tightly, caught by the music. Even the mall pianist, who had seen countless performers, found himself momentarily forgotten, his usual confidence replaced by curiosity and slight disbelief. He knew instantly this was no casual player. This was someone with real mastery, someone who had spent countless hours understanding the language of music. The man's eyes remained soft, focused on the keys. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't react to the whispers or the growing number of people gathering. He played as if the piano and he were the only two things in the world. Yet, without trying, he held everyone's attention. People stopped shopping, stopped checking their phones, stopped talking. And music demanded it. The mall pianist tried to imagine where the man could have learned to play like this. The technique was flawless, but it was the feeling behind it that was most striking. It wasn't just precision or speed. It was the ability to make each note matter, to weave a story through sound. Even the most experienced musicians sometimes struggled to do that. Yet here it was, in a busy mall, being played by someone who seemed so unassuming. A few minutes passed, though it felt much shorter to those listening. The man moved from one melody to another seamlessly, each transition smooth and natural. Some notes were quiet and contemplative, drawing listeners inward, making them reflect on things they hadn't thought about for a long time. Others were bold and powerful, causing the crowd to lean in unconsciously, drawn to the emotional force. People glanced at each other, silently sharing the feeling, the surprise, the awe. The music had begun to alter the mall itself. The usual background noises, footsteps, chatter, cash registers faded into insignificance. Shoppers, employees, and even passers-by were drawn to the piano, magnetized by the unexpected beauty. It wasn't just a performance, it was an experience. People felt transported, even if only for a few minutes, from the ordinary routines of their day into a place of wonder and quiet amazement. The mall pianist could no longer deny the reality. The man sitting at the piano was extraordinary. He had come in quietly, politely, unassuming in every way, yet he had seized the attention of everyone in the corridor effortlessly. The crowd that had chuckled moments ago was now completely absorbed. Even those who had been skeptical or dismissive now leaned forward, as if they were afraid to miss a single note dot in that moment. The mall felt smaller, more intimate, though it was filled with hundreds of people. There was a shared understanding among the audience that something remarkable was happening, something unexpected, something profoundly human. The man at the piano was not performing for fame or recognition. He was playing because he loved the music, because he wanted the piano to sing, and because he understood that even a few minutes of shared beauty could touch hearts in ways words could not. And so he continued, each note deliberate, each phrase full of feeling. No one knew who he was, where he came from, or how he had learned to play like this. All they knew was that the mall, a place of commerce and noise, had become a temporary sanctuary for music, thanks to one quiet man at a piano whose presence had already begun to change the way everyone around him felt. The small crowd grew, unnoticed by the man, who remained focused entirely on the keys. People stopped in their tracks, drawn by the emotional power of the music. Conversations halted, phones lowered, and a hush spread across the corridor. Even the background noise of the mall seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of a single melody, floating effortlessly, touching everyone who listened. No one could predict what would happen next. The performance had just begun, but already the simple act of sitting down at a piano had transformed a busy Saturday afternoon into a moment that would be remembered. The laughter and chuckles of moments before had vanished, replaced by an attentive silence, a collective realization that something extraordinary was taking place. The man's hands moved gracefully. The moment he pressed the first key, the music seemed to breathe through the corridor, curling around shoppers and weaving through the bustle of the mall. People who had been casually passing by slowed down, some stopping entirely, captivated by the sound. The man sat at the piano with a calm concentration, his fingers moving with both precision and freedom. Every note felt intentional, every pause deliberate, as if he were not just playing music, but telling a story no one had ever heard before. The crowd had shifted. Those who had chuckled when he first sat down now stood silent, eyes fixed on his hands as they glided over the keys. The mall pianist, who had initially expected nothing more than a brief interlude of amateur play, now leaned slightly forward, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief crossing his face. He had spent years mastering music, performing for crowds, and teaching students. Yet the way this man handled the piano was different from anything he had seen. There was a fluidity and a depth to his touch that made it impossible to look away. People began to gather more closely. A young mother holding her child felt the child stiffen in her arms, staring wide-eyed at the piano as though seeing something magical. The couple who had been glancing casually now held each other tightly, caught in the spell of the music. Employees peeked from behind counters and display racks, unable to resist listening. The music was no longer just background noise. It had become a presence, commanding attention, stirring something deep inside those who heard it. The man's first melody had been gentle, soft, almost like a whisper. Now he transitioned seamlessly into a slightly faster tune, fingers moving, deftly but never hurriedly. The music ebbed and flowed naturally, rising and falling with a rhythm that felt almost alive. It was clear that he had a connection to every note, that he understood not just the mechanics of music, but the emotions it could evoke. Even without knowing the man's story, the audience could feel it, a sense of longing, of joy, of nostalgia. Woven into each phrase, the mall pianist watched intently. He had never before seen someone play with such mastery in a public space, and he could not help but be impressed. The man's technique was flawless, but it was the emotion behind it that struck him most. Each note seemed to tell a story that everyone in the corridor could feel, but no one could fully put into words. He realized that this was more than talent. It was understanding, it was connection, it was the ability to make people feel something profound, without saying a single word. Whispers began to circulate among the crowd. "He's amazing," one person said quietly. Another added, "I've never heard anything like this in a mall before." Even those who had been skeptical or indifferent at first could not hide their astonishment. People who had been checking their phones or shopping lists now turned fully toward the piano, drawn by the music. Some raised their phones to record, but many found themselves lowering them, realizing that no recording could capture the feeling of being there. In that moment, the man did not acknowledge the growing attention. His eyes remained focused on the keys, his body relaxed yet poised. There was no showmanship, no attempt to impress. He was simply playing, letting the music speak for itself. And that was what made it so powerful. It was authentic, unforced, and completely captivating. People felt it in their bones, in their hearts, in ways that were almost physical. The mall had become a stage, but it was a stage without barriers, a place where everyone could share in the experience equally. A few teenagers who had laughed at the beginning now stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away. Their earlier jokes and teasing had vanished, replaced by awe. One of them whispered to a friend, He's really good. Like unbelievably good. The friend nodded silently, unable to speak without disturbing the spell that had settled over the crowd. Even the young mother who had been holding her child seemed transfixed, her eyes glistening slightly as she listened to the melodies rise and fall. The man's hands moved effortlessly, almost as if they were extensions of his own thoughts. Each note was clear and distinct, yet the transitions were seamless, flowing naturally from one phrase to the next. There was a rhythm that made the music feel alive, as if it were breathing with the people who were listening. It was not just technical skill that held the audience's attention. It was the way the music connected to them, making them feel emotions they had not expected to feel in a bustling mall on a Saturday afternoon. The mall pianist felt a mix of admiration and humility. He had spent years perfecting his craft, performing in front of crowds, teaching students, and yet he had never encountered anyone who could capture both the precision and the emotional depth that this man displayed so effortlessly. He realized that talent alone could not explain what he was seeing. This was something more profound, something rare, a combination of skill, experience, and heart that left even a seasoned musician in awe. The crowd grew larger as more people paused in their shopping to listen. A young man who had been walking past with headphones around his neck stopped, pulling them off in disbelief. The music drew him in completely. Store employees peeked from behind shelves, unable to resist the sound. Even those who had been entirely focused on errands or conversations found themselves pulled into the spell. The mall had transformed from a place of commerce and noise into a quiet sanctuary, a temporary space where music held everyone together. The man's playing became more intricate. He moved into faster sequences, notes overlapping in complex patterns that required incredible skill to execute cleanly. Yet even as the complexity increased, the emotion remained. It was not just about speed or technicality. It was about storytelling. Each note, each chord, each pause carried meaning. Listeners could feel the tension, the release, the peaks and valleys of emotion. The music was alive, and it demanded to be felt, not just heard. People began to react in small ways. Some tapped their feet subtly to the rhythm. Others closed their eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over them. A few let out small sighs, as if the melody had reached into places they hadn't thought about in years. Conversations ceased entirely. Even the usual hum of the mall seemed to fade into silence, replaced by the flow of the piano. The man at the keys played with a quiet intensity that was mesmerizing, holding the attention of everyone in a way that no announcement or display could. The mall pianist had stepped closer now, unable to resist the pull of the performance. He watched the man's hands, the way they moved with both precision and ease, the way each finger struck the keys with purpose. He realized that this was someone who understood music on a level he had rarely encountered. It was more than skill. It was empathy, emotion, and understanding, all expressed through the instrument. He felt a quiet respect, tinged with awe, for the man who had transformed a simple public piano into a vessel for art. The man continued to play, shifting between melodies seamlessly. One moment, the music was soft and contemplative, drawing listeners inward, making them reflect on things they hadn't thought about for a long time. The next moment, it surged with energy and power, filling them all with a sense of grandeur that was unexpected in such a casual setting. Each change was smooth, natural, and emotionally resonant. The audience felt it all, caught between the quiet introspection and the stirring crescendos, fully immersed in the experience. Even those who had been skeptical from the beginning could not deny the effect. The teenagers who had laughed now looked at each other in awe. The young mother held her child close, whispering softly, "Listen, isn't it beautiful?" The couple who had been glancing casually now stood silently, hands intertwined, completely absorbed. The mole pianist, who had seen many performers, felt a pang of humility. He knew he was witnessing something exceptional, something rare, something that could not be taught or faked. The man at the piano remained unaware of the attention he had drawn. He did not look up or acknowledge the crowd. His focus was entirely on the music, on the story he was telling through the keys. And perhaps that was why it was so powerful. He played not for recognition, not for applause, not for fame. He played because the music demanded it, because it was part of who he was, and because he understood the profound effect it could have on those who listened. Time seemed to stretch and bend. Minutes felt like seconds, yet each note resonated. Long after it had been played, people forgot about their shopping lists, their appointments, their errands. All that mattered was the music, the experience, the unexpected magic of a stranger at a piano who had captured the attention and hearts of everyone around him. Even those who had been in a hurry stopped, letting themselves be drawn in, caught by the subtlety and power of the performance. The mole pianist finally spoke softly, almost to himself. "I've never seen anything like this." He watched. The man's hands move effortlessly, each note clear, each chord purposeful. It was not just talent. It was understanding, emotion, and connection all at once. He realized that this was the kind of moment musicians dream of, witnessing someone who not only plays flawlessly, but also reaches into the hearts of listeners, creating a shared experience that transcends words. The audience continued to grow, though the man did not notice. Passers-by stopped, some curious, some drawn by the beauty of the music. Conversations that had been ongoing faded into silence. People held. The music continued to fill them all, carrying a presence that was impossible to ignore. The man at the piano played as though the keys were an extension of himself, each note deliberate, each pause full of intention. The melody was no longer just a string of sounds. It had become a living story, unfolding before the audience in ways that reached into hearts and minds. People who had been walking past stopped entirely, drawn to the sound like moths to a flame. Even those who had come to the mall with other plans now found themselves rooted in place, unable to tear their attention away. The mall pianist, who had been performing just moments earlier, had stepped closer now, standing almost beside the bench. He watched intently, trying to understand what he was witnessing. His own hands itched to play, but he held back, mesmerized by the way the man moved across the keys. There was an effortless elegance to every motion, a fluidity that made even the most difficult sequences appear simple. He recognized immediately that this was not just skill. It was artistry, a kind of musical storytelling that few could master. The audience had grown significantly. More people had paused, pulled by the emotional force of the performance. Some had come from nearby stores, attracted by the sound that cut through the usual hum of commerce and chatter. A young woman with a notebook in her hand stopped mid-step, staring at the piano in awe, her pencil forgotten. A child tugged at a parent's sleeve, pointing toward the man as if signaling a secret only they could understand. Parents held children closer, their eyes wide with amazement, silently communicating that what they were witnessing was extraordinary. The man's fingers moved across the keys with precision, but it was not just speed or technique that held the audience in rapture. It was the emotion behind each note, the way he seemed to understand the subtle nuances of sound and feeling. One moment, the music was soft and tender, almost fragile, drawing listeners inward. The next, it surged with power, filling them all, with energy that made people catch their breath. The shifts were seamless, natural, and filled with purpose, creating a rhythm that felt alive, as if the piano itself were speaking. The mall pianist had never felt anything like it. He had performed for audiences many times, played challenging pieces in concert halls, and taught students the subtleties of expression, but this was different. This was not a performance aimed at impressing others or showcasing talent. This was music in its purest form, a connection between a man, his piano, and everyone who had the good fortune to listen. He realized that the audience was not just hearing the notes. They were feeling the story behind them, the emotion carried within each chord and pause. Some of the initial skeptics, including a group of teenagers who had laughed when the man first approached, now stood in stunned silence. Their earlier amusement had vanished completely, replaced by awe and curiosity. One whispered to another, "I didn't know a person could play like this." His friend nodded, unable to respond with words, eyes fixed on the piano, as if seeing something impossible yet real. Even the people who had been in a hurry, glancing at watches and thinking of appointments, could not resist the pull. The music had stopped time, at least for a few minutes, holding everyone in a shared moment of wonder. The man did not look at anyone, did not seek recognition or applause. His gaze remained fixed on the keys, his body relaxed but perfectly aligned with the instrument. Each movement was intentional, precise, and yet natural. The audience felt the authenticity in every note. There was no pretense, no showmanship, no attempt to grab attention. The music itself was enough, and it spoke louder than any words could. People were captivated not because of who he was, but because of what he was creating in that moment. Subtle hush fell over the crowd as the man transitioned into a more complex section of the piece. Notes cascaded faster now, intertwining in intricate patterns that required extraordinary skill to execute cleanly. But even in this technical display, the emotion never wavered. The music carried layers of feeling, joy, sadness, nostalgia, and hope, all intertwined seamlessly. Listeners could feel the ebb and flow, the tension and release, as if the piano were telling a story that words could never capture. The mall pianist shifted slightly, taking in the full scope of what was happening. He had always believed that music could move people, that it could evoke emotions, but he had never seen it happen with such immediacy and intensity in a public space. He could sense the collective heartbeat of the audience, synchronized with the rise and fall of the melody. Even casual listeners who had stumbled upon the scene found themselves affected in ways they could not explain. It was a rare moment, a perfect alignment of talent, emotion, and timing. The man's hands continued to move with extraordinary fluidity. He transitioned from gentle lyrical passages to bold, energetic sequences with ease, never breaking the flow of the music. The audience was held in rapture, responding instinctively to the rhythm and emotion. Some swayed slightly, caught in the movement of the melody. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound envelop them completely. Even those who had come with little interest in music found themselves swept up in the experience, transported beyond the walls of the mall into A world crafted entirely by sound. The child in the crowd tugged at a parent's sleeve again, pointing at the piano with wide eyes. The parent smiled softly, whispering, "Isn't it amazing?" The child nodded, barely able to contain the sense of wonder that bubbled up inside. It was a moment of shared amazement, a connection between generations that transcended age or experience. People who had never met found themselves united in silent appreciation, bound together by the power of the music. The man at the piano remained focused, yet there was a subtle warmth in his playing that suggested awareness of the audience's presence. He did not pause or break the flow, but the music seemed to reach out to each listener individually, touching hearts in ways that were almost personal. Some felt a sense of nostalgia, memories from childhood rising unbidden. Others felt hope, a quiet reassurance that beauty and artistry could appear in the most ordinary places. The effect was profound and unspoken, a shared human experience created without words. The mole pianist stepped even closer, curiosity and admiration mingling in his expression. He had spent years refining his own skills, yet he could not fully grasp the depth of this man's ability. It was not just technical mastery. It was understanding, intuition, and empathy expressed through every note. He realized that the man was telling a story, one that reached everyone in the corridor, regardless of who they were or where they had come from. The music was a bridge, connecting strangers through emotion and shared experience. As the melody continued, subtle changes in tempo and intensity captured the audience's attention even more. A quiet, introspective section caused people to lean in, listening closely, hearts softening. The next passage surged with energy, eliciting audible gasps and sighs of admiration. The transitions were seamless, almost invisible, yet powerful, enough to shift the mood of the entire crowd. Every listener became part of the story, participating in the unspoken dialogue between musician and audience. People began to notice small details in the performance. The way the man's fingers curved naturally over the keys, the gentle movements of his wrists, the way he breathed in rhythm with the music. Every subtle gesture added depth to the experience. It was as if he and the piano were one entity, communicating through a language only they could fully understand, yet whose meaning was clear to all who listened. The mall pianist found himself studying each movement, trying to absorb some of the technique and artistry he witnessed. The audience was completely captivated. Teenagers who had laughed at the beginning now stood wide-eyed. Parents held children close. Couples exchanged quiet glances of shared amazement. The music had erased distractions, creating a space of collective focus and emotion. Even passers-by, who had not intended to stop, found themselves lingering, drawn by the power and beauty of the performance. The man at the piano had transformed a simple public space into a sanctuary of music and feeling. The music began to build toward a crescendo. Notes collided and intertwined in intricate patterns, creating a sense of urgency and excitement. The audience felt their own emotions rise in response, hearts beating faster, breaths quickening. The mall pianist felt a surge of inspiration, realizing that this was what true artistry could do. It could move people in ways beyond logic or explanation. The man at the piano was not just performing. He was creating an emotional experience that transcended the ordinary. And yet, through all of this, the man remained humble, focused solely on the music. There was no pretense, no effort to draw attention to himself. He played because it was necessary, because the music demanded it, because he understood its power and beauty. The audience responded naturally, drawn into the performance by the authenticity and skill that radiated from every note. It was a rare moment, a spontaneous convergence of talent, emotion, and human connection that could not be recreated or forced. The crescendo reached its peak, filling the mall with a wave of sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air. People felt it in their chests, in their hearts, in their bones. Some closed their eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity. Others looked around, sharing silent expressions of awe and amaze. The mall remained quiet for a few seconds after the final note faded into the air, but it was a quiet filled with a sense of awe, of disbelief, and of admiration. People were frozen in place, caught between the urge to clap and the reluctance to disturb the lingering magic that hung over the corridor. The man at the piano did not move. He simply rested his hands lightly on the keys, as if taking a brief pause before continuing his dialogue with the instrument. There was a calmness about him, a quiet confidence that made the moment feel even more extraordinary. The crowd began to stir slowly, murmurs of amazement spreading like ripples in a pond. "Did you hear that?" someone whispered. Another added, "I've never experienced anything like that in my life." People exchanged glances, and in those looks were shared emotions: awe, respect, gratitude, and wonder. Even those who had been skeptical from the beginning could not hide their astonishment. What had started as a casual glance at a man sitting at a public piano had turned into a shared human experience that none of them would forget. The mall pianist, who had been standing nearby, took a step closer, his eyes wide with amazement. He had seen performers before, talented musicians who could play with skill and speed, but there was something about this man that set him apart. It was not just the technical mastery, though that was certainly impressive. It was the emotion, the depth, the ability to communicate through music in a way that touched every listener differently, yet left them all equally moved. He felt a pang of humility and inspiration at the same time, realizing that there were still people in the world who could surprise even seasoned musicians. The man at the piano began to play again, this time with a soft, deliberate melody that seemed to fill the air with warmth and calm. The notes were gentle and flowing, creating a sense of intimacy despite the crowd surrounding him. Each chord was carefully placed, resonating in a way that seemed to echo not just in the space, but in the hearts of the listeners. People leaned in slightly, as if trying to catch every nuance, every subtle shift in the music. The mall had transformed completely, from a bustling place of commerce into a quiet, shared sanctuary of sound and emotion. Parents held their children closer, pointing at the piano and whispering softly, "Listen, just listen." The children's eyes were wide with curiosity and wonder, their small hands clinging to their parents as if drawn into the spell of the music. Teenagers who had been giggling and joking before now stood silently, captivated, their expressions a mixture of surprise and admiration. Even people who had been walking quickly through the mall to reach other destinations found themselves stopping, drawn inexplicably toward the sound. The music began to shift, becoming more intricate, more layered. The man's fingers moved with extraordinary speed and precision, yet there was no sense of urgency or effort. Each note seemed to arrive exactly when it was meant to, each chord flowing naturally into the next. The mall pianist watched, captivated, taking in the subtle dynamics, the way the man's hands curved and flexed, the way his wrists moved with fluid grace. He realized that this was someone who had spent countless hours studying the piano, mastering not just the mechanics, but the expression, the emotion, the artistry. The crowd grew larger as more people were drawn to the music. Employees stepped out from their stores, shoppers paused in the middle of aisles, and even people who had originally intended to ignore the piano now found themselves captivated. There was a sense of collective attention, a shared focus on something larger than any individual. It was as if the man's music had created a temporary community, united by the sheer beauty and power of sound. People who had never met before were connected, silently acknowledging the wonder of the moment. The man continued to play, seamlessly transitioning from delicate flowing passages to more powerful, bold sections that filled the space with energy. The music rose and fell like waves, carrying the audience along in its rhythm. Some listeners closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried away entirely, while others watched the man's hands, mesmerized by the speed, accuracy, and grace of his movements. The mall pianist felt a surge of inspiration, realizing that this was a performance that could not be forgotten, a rare moment of genuine artistry in the most ordinary of places. People began to react in small, instinctive ways. Some tapped their feet to the rhythm, others swayed slightly, caught in the movement of the music. A few let out quiet gasps or whispered to companions in awe. Even the most distracted shoppers found themselves drawn into the spell, their minds clearing of mundane concerns, replaced by the simple, profound experience of listening. It was remarkable how one person, sitting quietly at a piano, could hold the attention and emotions of so many with nothing but music. The man's hands moved with astonishing skill, creating melodies that were both complex and deeply expressive. There was a balance between precision and feeling that made every note meaningful. It was not just a display of talent, but of understanding, the understanding that music is more than sound. It is connection, communication, and emotion made tangible. Each listener seemed to feel something unique, yet everyone shared in the overall experience, bound together by the invisible threads of the music. The mall pianist, standing close enough to see every detail, could feel the intensity of the performance. He had performed countless times, yet this was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. There was a purity in the man's playing, a dedication to the craft, and a love of music that transcended mere performance. It was clear that he did not play for recognition or applause. He played because it was an essential part of who he was, and because he understood the impact music could have on others. The audience was completely absorbed. Conversations had stopped, phones had been lowered, and even the background noise of the mall had faded into insignificance. All that mattered was the music, the way it flowed through the air, touching each person differently, but profoundly. People leaned in, hearts softening, eyes widening, smiles forming unconsciously. It was a shared experience of emotion and beauty. Spontaneous yet intensely human, the man transitioned into another section of the piece, moving faster now, fingers dancing across the keys in a display of technical mastery that was breathtaking to watch. Yet despite the speed and complexity, there was no sense of showmanship. Every note, every chord, every pause was deliberate, serving the emotion of the music rather than the ego of the performer. Listeners could feel the intensity without feeling overwhelmed, drawn into the energy, while still able to appreciate the subtleties and nuance of each phrase. A young woman in the crowd pressed her hands together, almost in prayer, as she listened. A child held a parent's hand tightly, as if needing grounding in the midst of something too big to comprehend. Teenagers exchanged glances, eyes wide with awe. The mall pianist's own hands itched to play, but he held back, recognizing that what was happening could not be interrupted or imitated. It was something unique, a rare alignment of talent, emotion, and presence that created a moment of pure wonder. The music began to soften once more, returning to a gentle, flowing melody that felt almost like a conversation. The man's hands moved delicately, coaxing the piano to sing softly, creating a sense of intimacy despite the growing crowd. People leaned in, listening to every subtle inflection, every tender note. The mall had become a place of quiet reflection, where even amidst the chaos of shoppers and background noise, the music commanded attention, drawing people into a shared moment of beauty and stillness. The mall pianist took a deep breath, overwhelmed by the artistry he was witnessing. He had spent his life studying music, yet he recognized that there were levels of understanding and connection that he had not yet experienced. This man at the piano had not only mastered technique, but had unlocked a form of expression that was almost spiritual in its power. It was not something that could be taught or learned quickly. It was the result of dedication, passion, and a deep connection to the music itself. The crowd shifted slightly, but no one moved away. People were held in place by the music, caught between admiration and disbelief. Some whispered quietly to companions, trying to articulate what they were feeling, but words seemed inadequate. Others simply stood, silent, letting the music wash over them, filling their minds and hearts with a sense of wonder. The mall had been transformed from a place of ordinary transactions into a space of shared human experience. United by sound and emotion, the man's fingers glided across the keys. With effortless grace, transitioning between soft passages and bold, sweeping sections that filled the corridor with resonance. The audience felt the shifts instinctively, leaning in, swaying, sighing, and even tearing up at certain moments. It was as though the music itself had a consciousness, reaching into each person, finding a place within them that longed for beauty and connection. Even those who had entered the mall distracted or stressed now felt a profound sense of calm and awe as the piece progressed. The music became more intense, more complex, yet still deeply emotional. The man's hands flew across the keys with technical brilliance, yet each note carried meaning. The mall pianist felt a mixture of humility and inspiration, recognizing the rare talent before him. He realized that the performance was not only a demonstration of skill, but also the music had reached a point where it seemed to take over the very air around the mall. People felt it in their chest, a vibration that was not just sound, but emotion made tangible. The man at the piano did not rush. He let each note hang just long enough to be felt, long enough for the audience to absorb the feeling before moving to the next. His hands glided over the keys as if they were an extension of his soul, each movement precise yet effortless. There was a connection to the instrument that was almost sacred, a deep understanding of how to make the piano sing in ways that went beyond technical skill. The mall pianist could no longer hold back his curiosity. He stepped closer, studying the man's technique and demeanor. He had spent decades mastering his own craft, yet he realized with a mixture of awe and humility that this was a level of mastery he had rarely seen, even in professional concert halls. The control, the fluidity, the emotion, it was all present, wrapped together in a performance that was both technically flawless and profoundly human. He felt an urge to speak, to ask where the man had learned to play, but he held back, sensing that nothing should disturb this moment. The crowd had grown even larger, pulled by the sound and by the visible intensity of the performance. People came from nearby stores, curious shoppers drawn by the music, strangers pausing in hallways. Each new person seemed immediately captivated, their attention held completely by the performance. Families huddled together, teens stopped texting, and employees leaned out from behind counters, all united by the same awe and wonder. The music had created a spontaneous gathering, a shared human experience that transcended the ordinary bustle of the mall. The man's fingers moved over the keys with fluid grace, effortlessly transitioning from soft, gentle passages to sections that were bold, expansive, and thrilling. Each chord was deliberate, each pause full of intention. The music carried a narrative, though it was one without words. It told of joy, sorrow, hope, longing, and triumph, all intertwined in a seamless flow that held the audience in rapt attention. People felt their hearts lift, then ache, then fill with a sense of quiet peace, all within the span of a single melody. The mall pianist could feel the energy of the crowd shifting in response. What had started as casual curiosity had turned into something more profound. People were no longer just listening. They were participating in a shared emotional journey. Some swayed slightly, caught in the rhythm. Others closed their eyes, letting the music guide their thoughts and emotions. Even those who had entered the mall distracted, thinking only of errands or shopping lists, were now fully present, immersed in the performance. A young woman, standing near a bench, pressed her hands to her chest, as if trying to contain the feeling rising inside her. A child clutched a parent's arm, wide-eyed and silent, taking in the magic without fully understanding it. Teenagers who had been laughing and joking earlier now whispered in awe, exchanging glances of disbelief. The mall had been transformed, if only for this moment, into a space of quiet reflection, connection, and shared wonder. The man at the piano continued without pause, seemingly unaware of the size of the audience or the reactions he was drawing. His focus remained entirely on the instrument, yet there was an unmistakable warmth in his playing, an awareness that the music was reaching beyond the keys and into the hearts of those who listened. The connection was subtle but profound, a quiet intimacy that made each person feel as though the performance were personal, made just for them. The melodies grew more intricate, weaving together multiple lines that required extraordinary dexterity and control. The audience sensed the complexity, even if they did not understand the technical aspects. They felt the layers, the rises and falls, the interplay of tension and resolution. Every listener was caught in the ebb and flow, drawn along. The musical journey without resistance. It was a rare moment when art moved people collectively, yet each person experienced it individually, in their own unique way. The mall pianist could feel a wave of inspiration wash over him. He had dedicated his life to music, yet he realized that even his understanding was limited compared to what he was witnessing. The performance was not just about notes or technique. It was about connection, about communicating something that went beyond words. He recognized the subtle choices, the pacing, the delicate touch that transformed technical mastery into an emotional experience. He felt privileged to witness it, knowing that such moments were rare and fleeting. People in the crowd began to react in subtle, instinctive ways. Some leaned forward, trying to catch every nuance. Others tapped their feet or nodded along with the rhythm. A few let out quiet sighs, their expressions reflecting the emotions stirred within them. Conversations had ceased entirely. Phones, usually an extension of attention, were mostly lowered, abandoned for the spell of the music. The mall, typically a place of noise and distraction, had become a shared sanctuary, a place where strangers were united in silent admiration and emotional resonance. The music transitioned again, becoming gentler, almost like a whisper. Each note was deliberate, delicate, as if coaxing the audience to feel more deeply. People leaned in instinctively, holding their breath, caught in the intimacy of the moment. The crescendo that had surged before now softened into a warm, flowing rhythm that allowed listeners to reflect on what they had already felt. The man's hands moved with care, balancing technical skill with expression, creating a sound that was both precise and deeply human. Even those who were unfamiliar with classical music or piano performances felt the impact. The emotion was universal, transcending knowledge or expertise. The crowd, diverse in age, background, and experience, was caught in a shared moment of connection. Parents exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the beauty of the performance. Teenagers whispered in disbelief, amazed at the skill and artistry before them. Strangers held eyes for a brief moment, united by the unspoken language of music that had brought them together. The mall pianist, still watching closely, realized that this was a masterclass in expression and technique unfolding in real time. Each movement of the man's hands, each choice of timing, each subtle touch of a key was part of a larger conversation with the audience. He could see the care in the positioning of the wrists, the curve of the fingers, the slight inclinations of the body that allowed for effortless expression. This was not simply a performance. It was a lesson in connecting with others through art. The music began to rise again, building subtly before transitioning into a lively, energetic section. The audience felt the shift immediately. Hearts raced slightly, breaths quickened, and a wave of excitement spread. Children clutched hands, teenagers leaned in, and adults unconsciously swayed with the rhythm. The mall pianist felt the energy and vibrancy of the moment, the way it drew people together, the way it created a sense of shared experience that was rare in such a public setting. The man's fingers danced across the keys, faster and more intricate than before, yet every note landed perfectly, each phrase perfectly balanced. The audience could feel the precision, even if they did not understand the technicalities. They sensed the effortlessness, the mastery, and the emotion behind every movement. Some gasped softly, others whispered in awe, and a few were visibly moved to tears. It was as if the music had unlocked a hidden well of feeling, drawing it to the surface where it could be shared openly. A mall pianist could feel his own heart lifting with the music. He recognized the difficulty and skill involved, yet he was more affected by the way the music reached the audience. It was not a display for admiration alone. It was a gift, a shared human experience, a reminder that art could touch people in ways words could not. He found himself thinking about the countless students he had taught, and how many of them had struggled to understand that music was not just notes, but emotion, connection, and storytelling. This man at the piano was demonstrating it perfectly. The audience began to feel the emotional weight of the performance. The soft passages allowed for introspection, for memories and thoughts to rise in response to the music. The energetic sections brought exhilaration and joy, causing people to lean in, smile, and breathe in rhythm with the melody. Even strangers who had no shared history were connected, caught together in the unfolding journey. It was as if the music had created a temporary community, united by shared emotion and awe. The man transitioned again, bringing the piece to a gentle, contemplative ending. The music softened, slowing to a delicate conclusion that seemed to hang in the air. People held their breath, savoring the final moments. The mall pianist watched, moved by the experience, realizing that this was a rare occurrence where artistry, emotion, and audience converged perfectly. He could see the impact on the crowd, the softened expressions, the tears, the smiles, the awe. As the last note lingered and faded, a profound silence followed. It was a silence filled with reverence, with appreciation, with a shared sense of having witnessed something extraordinary. People did not immediately clap or speak. They simply absorbed the moment, letting it settle over them. The man at the piano rested his hands gently on the keys, breathing calmly, his focus still inward, as though reflecting on the music he had created. The audience began to murmur softly, voices filled with wonder and admiration. The mall remained silent for several moments after the last note faded, and in that silence, the audience could feel the weight of what had just happened. It was more than a performance. It was a shared experience, something rare and fleeting, that had left everyone altered, if only slightly. People looked at each other with wide eyes, some whispering softly, trying to articulate what they had felt. "Did you feel that?" a woman asked her companion. The man nodded, unable to respond with words, his expression still heavy with awe. The crowd had been changed by the music, bonded in a moment that would linger in memory long after they left. The man at the piano finally lifted his gaze. He looked around slowly, taking in the faces of those who had gathered. Some were smiling, some were teary-eyed, and many simply stared in quiet amazement. His calm demeanor suggested humility, as if he had done nothing extraordinary, though everyone else knew differently. There was no arrogance, no sense of triumph. He simply acknowledged the presence of the audience with a subtle nod, his focus remaining gentle and composed. It was a quiet confidence, a knowledge that what he had given was enough, and that the impact of the music was evident on its own. People began to move slowly, unwilling to break the spell completely, but the shift was subtle. Some walked toward the piano to drop a few coins, though it was clear the gesture was less about money and more about gratitude. Others stayed a few steps back, hesitant to intrude on the private connection the man had with the instrument. Conversations remained hushed. No one dared speak too loudly, afraid of shattering the lingering emotion that still floated in the air. It was rare to witness something that commanded such collective respect and attention, and everyone seemed aware of that. The mall pianist, who had been standing quietly to the side, finally spoke, his voice soft but full of admiration. I don't think I've ever seen anyone play like that," he said. The man at the piano simply smiled faintly, a small acknowledgement rather than a reply. There was a humility in the gesture that matched the performance itself. It was clear that recognition or praise was not the reason he had played. The music had been enough, its impact undeniable and profound, and that was what mattered most. The audience began to disperse gradually, but no one was in a rush. People lingered, walking slowly, sharing quiet words with companions, or simply staring at the piano as if reluctant to leave. The mall, which had been bustling with ordinary chatter and movement, now had a sense of stillness, a lingering reverence that could not be explained. Even those who had been initially skeptical or indifferent found themselves affected in ways they did not fully understand. There was a beauty to the moment that transcended explanation, and it lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. A young child approached the piano cautiously, curiosity outweighing shyness. The parent allowed the child to step closer, and the child pressed a small hand gently on a key, eliciting a soft, delicate sound. The man at the piano observed quietly, giving a small, encouraging smile, and the child stepped back, eyes wide and shining with excitement. It was a simple moment, yet it carried weight, a reminder that music could inspire, could teach, and could create a spark of wonder in anyone, no matter their age or background. The mall pianist knelt slightly to examine the keys more closely. Still in awe, he had spent years studying technique and expression, but what he had witnessed today went far beyond that. The performance had been flawless technically, yet what set it apart was the humanity woven into every note. It was a reminder that music was not just about skill or speed or recognition, but about connecting, touching lives, and creating shared moments of beauty that lingered long after the last note had faded. People began to speak more freely, softly, commenting to companions about what they had just heard. "I've never felt anything like that," one whispered. Another said, "It's like he was speaking directly to everyone's heart." A few wiped tears quietly, moved by the depth of emotion. Even those who had entered the mall thinking only of errands or casual shopping now had a story to tell, a memory that would last far longer than the clothes or products they had come to buy. The music had created something timeless, intangible, yet undeniably present. The man at the piano finally stood. He straightened slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, showing no haste or desire for attention. People instinctively gave him space, sensing that this moment, while complete in sound, still carried a quiet, lingering presence. He placed his hands lightly on the keys one last time, letting the touch linger, as if paying silent respect to the instrument that it carried. His voice. It was a gesture of quiet reverence, the final punctuation in a performance that had already spoken volumes. The mall pianist stepped forward cautiously. I don't know how to say it," he admitted. "That was incredible. I've never seen anything like it in my life." The man smiled again, a faint, humble expression. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice calm but sincere. There was no pretense in his words, only a quiet acknowledgement that the experience had been shared and appreciated. It was clear that the performance had been as much for himself as for the audience, an offering of expression, a gift of art without expectation. The crowd continued to thin, but the impact lingered. People walked slowly through the corridors, talking quietly, exchanging glances of shared amazement. Strangers had connected through the performance, if only briefly, united in awe and appreciation. Parents held children close, whispering about the beauty they had witnessed. Teenagers still murmured in disbelief, replaying moments in their minds. The mall had returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet it had been irrevocably changed. Every passerby carried with them the memory of the extraordinary. The man gathered his belongings, moving deliberately, but without hurry. He paused once, more at the piano, his fingers brushing the keys lightly. There was a sense of completion in the gesture, a recognition that the music had been given and received. The crowd instinctively backed up slightly, allowing him space, sensing the gravity of the moment. He moved on, walking calmly toward the exit, leaving behind an audience that remained quietly reverent, still processing the profound effect of the music they had heard. The mall pianist lingered a moment longer, hands hovering above the keys, as if reluctant to let the connection end. He felt a deep respect for the man, realizing that this performance had been far more than a demonstration of talent. It was a lesson in humility, in presence, and in the power of music to reach people in ways words could never achieve. He took a deep breath, allowing himself to fully appreciate the impact, knowing that what he had witnessed would stay with him for the rest of his life. People began to leave, slowly filtering back into the ordinary rhythm of the mall. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone now, softer, reflective, more attentive. Children chattered excitedly about the music they had heard. Parents whispered about the emotion it had stirred. And teenagers replayed the performance in their minds, still in awe. The music had created a lasting impression, a memory that would be retold and cherished, a reminder of the extraordinary found in the most ordinary of places. Even after the crowd had dispersed, a few lingered near the piano, hesitant to break the spell completely. Some pressed their hands lightly to the keys, letting the sound echo softly, while others simply stood and listened, savoring the silence that remained. It was a quiet reverence, a way of honoring the performance that had just taken place, and a recognition that what they had witnessed was rare, precious, and fleeting. The man at the piano had left, but his presence lingered in the minds and hearts of everyone who had listened. People carried with them a sense of wonder and inspiration, a reminder of the human capacity to create beauty and connection. For some, it sparked a desire to pursue music themselves. For others, it was a moment of reflection on life, emotions, and the shared experiences that make human existence meaningful. The impact of the music extended far beyond the notes themselves, touching lives in ways that could not be quantified, but would be remembered forever. The mall pianist finally returned to his own instrument, inspired and invigorated. He could feel a renewed passion, a deeper understanding of what it meant to play music that truly reached people. He realized that technique, skill, and years of practice were only part of the equation. The rest was heart, intention, and the courage to connect with others through sound. He sat down and began to play softly at first, feeling the influence of the earlier performance guiding his fingers. Each note carried a sense of gratitude and inspiration, a continuation of the story that had been shared with the crowd. In the days that followed, people continued to talk about what they had witnessed. Stories spread about the man who had appeared at the public piano and created a performance that moved hundreds of people without warning. Some shared videos, though. Many said the recordings could not capture the true experience. People reflected on the emotions they had felt, the sense of connection and awe, and the reminder that beauty and artistry could appear anywhere, Unexpectedly, if one was willing to pause and listen, the memory of the performance lingered for weeks, even months. Those who had been there spoke of it to friends and family, recalling specific moments, particular notes, and the